to another week of online government. This week we are going to go over the Senate, the companion piece to last week's going over the House, and we're also going to jump into committees, which are sub-organizations within both the House and the Senate. So, first of all, the Senate is considered the upper house. Eh? Eh? Yeah, I do what I can. All right. It is the upper house. It is considered the more senior house, and we'll kind of see why as we go through here. But long story short, it's considered the senior house because you need to be older to get into it, and it is a trickier job to get. Also, it's not open as often. Who are our two senators? Hopefully, you recognize the two gentlemen up here. We've got Jon Tester, who is our senior senator, and Steve Daines, who is our junior senator. All that means is that Tester has been in the Senate longer. It doesn't really matter for the state. Senatorial seniority will become a bigger issue when we get into committees a little bit later today. So, Senate locked in at 100 members currently. If we were to add another state, say we finally bother to add Puerto Rico as a state, then the Senate would automatically go up to 102 members because each state gets two senators, no exceptions. So the only people in the U.S. that kind of get really kind of toasted by this are the people that live in Washington, D.C., who do not have any sort of representation. We talked about that a while ago, where D.C.'s license plate, I think it still does, but I know it used to say taxation without representation. So the vast majority of Americans, though, have a senator. D.C. is our only real outlier other than people from like Guam and Puerto Rico. And they can still send people to observe in the Senate, but they don't get to vote. So, senators are going to serve a 6-year term. 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years. It's called a senatorial class. So, 1/3 of the Senate will be up for election or re-election, as the case may be, this fall. And they will be the class of 2020. And they will all serve together for at least the next 6 years. And then they can, run for re-election after that. So Daines is up next year? No, this year, because he's going to run against the Governor Bullock. So Daines and Bullock are running to be Montana's senator for the class of 2020. As Tester was elected in the 2018, or re-elected, I should say, in the 2018 elections, as a result of that, our 2022 elections in Montana will not see us putting a senator up for election because Tester and whoever wins November, either Bullock or Daines, will be in there as well. The rationale for this 6-year rolling membership in the Senate is a big deal, and it really shows a lot of forethought on the founding fathers' part. You want what's called institutional memory in the Senate. It's the same reason, actually, why not every single person that works in the federal bureaucracy is an elected official. Institutional memory says that sometimes people need to take time and learn what they're doing. And so what the 6-year time limit does with only 1/3 of the people being elected is it lets people develop some expertise in their area before they're immediately back up for re-election. The other thing this does, and this is a really big deal here, is it allows the Senate, as we're going to see, they fill a different role than the House. What the Senate is going to do is, and we've discussed this throughout the year, is they take a much longer term view of things. They're going to be the ones that deal with appointments, and they're also going to be the ones that deal with international policy that could affect us for decades to come. So you want to give your senators a little more leeway to make an unpopular decision that is the right decision in the long run. And by doing this, they're able to sort of avoid the heat of the moment voting that always eats up a lot of members of the House of Representatives. Now, clearly, Daines has to be a little careful this year with what he does voting wise, because if he's going to do something that would be unpopular for him to vote with his reelection coming up, the Republicans in the Senate might choose to say, hey, Senator Daines, you're up in a state that regularly elects both Democrats and Republicans to the Senate. Maybe you don't vote for this unpopular bill. Whereas Tester, if he were up for some sort of vote this year, on a bill that was unpopular. He could get away with voting for something that was unpopular, but he felt was necessary because it's a long time until he's up. It's another 4 years until he's up for reelection. And as a result of that, tempers can kind of cool. So that is a big thing to remember with the Senate, is that those 6-year terms allow for the Senate to make intelligent, well-reasoned, but possibly unpopular decisions. So that's a big thing I really want you guys to remember here. The map we can see on the right here is current. So purple states have one Republican and one Democrat, or in the case of Maine, an independent. And then we can see Republican and Democratic states. It's relatively even. I want to say right now it's 47 to 53 ish, but that independent from Maine always sort of throws a spanner into the works there. But 2014 was a big year for Republicans getting wins in the Senate, which means that a lot of Republicans who had not necessarily been from states that elected a ton of Republican senators are up this time. There we're talking more along the lines of, Iowa, Wisconsin with a Republican senator, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Those ones are a little more up in the air. We'll actually talk a little bit about some election forecasting stuff when we do current events later this week, so make sure you tune in for that. Let's keep rolling. All right, so this should look pretty similar to what we went over last week with House of Representatives. That's on purpose. So first of all, what do you need to qualify for to be a senator? You got to be 30 years old. It's a pretty easy step ladder to remember. You have to be 25 years old to be in the House. You have to be 30 years old to be in the Senate. You have to be 35 years old to be the president. And remember, that is always going to mean when you are sworn in. So you basically have to turn that appropriate date before early January. In the case of a Senate, rather than 7 years, which is what we saw in the House, it is now 9 or more years you have to be a U.S. citizen. It's the upper house. It's more senior. You're there for longer. They want to make sure that you are deeply entrenched in America and know what your constituents are looking for. And like the House, you have to live in the state that you represent. So it's not like somebody from Idaho could run for governor in Montana. They would have to move here and establish residency. So like Greg Gianforte, for example, is originally from Maryland and lived there for years and years and years until he moved out here to Billings or Bozeman. He had to establish residency here before he could run for the House, and now that he has residency, he can run for whatever he wants within the state. But you do have to establish residency within the state. The Senate is more relaxed. Now, I don't mean that they're like all super low-key. I just mean that the rules there are looser. Because of that seniority time that we talked about earlier, it's way easier for the Senate to justify taking unlimited time for debate. That is their big sort of claim to fame right here, is the unlimited time for debate. We'll talk about seniority in a second. But that unlimited debate time usually is used in a mature manner, but sometimes it can be used to filibuster as well. And so the filibuster is not used as much anymore. The picture you see above there is Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, because of course, South Carolina is, as we've discussed before, one of America's most racist states, and Strom Thurmond is one of America's most racist senators of all time. Here he is talking about, yet again, trying to stop a civil rights bill from going through. What he's doing right there, he talks for 24 hours and 18 minutes non-stop because nobody can really stop him. And the attempt here is basically to push as many people out of the room as possible due to sheer boredom or irritation that the vote does not happen or that a Senate session might close. It did not work. He faints after this, and he may or may not have been wearing a diaper. That is up for debate. But he literally just read off like a name of lists, or a list of names, sorry, like a phone book. And usually what will happen in a filibuster is somebody will make a cogent point for a couple of hours, and then it will just devolve into absolute madness. and the people can talk about whatever they want. Now, you might be saying, that seems like cheating. And no, it's not. The Senate is purposely installed the filibuster to make sure that it is available. But they also, as you can see in the tiny text down at the bottom, I'm not going to mouse over that because otherwise it'll bring up my menu on PowerPoint here. There is a way to end a filibuster, and it's called cloture. You can end a filibuster by having 60 members of the Senate vote for it. However, cloture has sort of been killed off. A lot of the stuff that let the Senate kind of be loosey-goosey with the way they dealt with things in the past has been killed under the majority leadership of Mitch McConnell over roughly the last decade, making the Senate more like the House than it had previously been. And that was very bothersome to a number of people. But the fact of the matter is that the House and the Senate both have the power, like it says in the Constitution, to make their own rules for a lot of stuff, which is why the House is so regimented and the Senate allows for filibuster. The Senate made these rules, and then you've heard it come out a couple times before called the nuclear option, which says you just need a simple majority. The idea behind the 60-member vote for cloture was that it was a rarity to have 60 members of one party in the Senate at a time, which would mean you would need to have at least some bipartisan support to end a filibuster. Nowadays, with the nuclear option, you just need a simple majority, which is 51 votes, which basically means that whoever the majority party is can shut down a filibuster. And the entire point of the filibuster was so minority parties could still have a voice and find a way to check aggressive policies. This is not to say this is only a Republican thing. The Democrats did this before. The Republicans did it. Now both sides have done it. They are both equally guilty. As I've said before in class, Mitch McConnell is just better at this than Harry Reid was. Another big thing in the Senate worth keeping in mind, it's harder to get kicked out of the Senate. Seniority there and holding onto your seat is a little easier. So seniority is a big deal. The longer you've been there, the more pull you have within the Senate. And because of that, you have a better choice of what committees you would like to sit on. So keep that in mind for later, is that seniority is going to determine basically who gets to call dibs in the Senate when dealing with virtually anything. And that dibs calling is a big, big, big deal in senatorial politics. Now, up here, this is sort of another actual encapsulation of the House versus the Senate. This is the Sumner caning incident. You may remember this from American history. We have a northern senator who talks a whole lot of smack about a southern senator whose nephew, this fellow here, Preston Brooks, is a member of the House and gets so mad at Senator Sumner that he comes in and brains him with a cane in the Senate and puts the guy into basically a coma for a long time. But that is just like, A, it's a rad picture, but B, drama does happen here. Thankfully, nobody's been like assaulted or murdered. We did talk about the a while ago, John Boehner, having a knife held to his throat by a member of the House of Representatives from Alaska, but nobody got stabbed that time. So into the more kind of boring rigmarole side of this. A senator, so just your regular representative from a state, that senator is going to make $174,000 a year, which you will remember is the exact same amount that a representative in the House of Representatives made. So it does not matter if you are in the upper or the lower house, you are making the same amount of money. The point there is to make sure that they're both compensated equally. It's a bicameral legislature. It's not like you have a lower paying house and a higher paying house. They make the same amount of money. They serve the same role in different ways. Next up, we have the President pro tempore of the Senate. Hopefully you remember him from our executive branch because, he comes in there after the House Majority Leader. I'm sorry, the Speaker of the House, if, the President and the Vice President are both gone. They're going to make $193,400 a year. That number may seem similar. Check out your House of Representatives notes again. The Majority and Minority Leader are also going to make $193,000 and $193,400 a year. That's exactly what it sounds like. While the president pro tem is literally just a mathematical determination who has been serving in the Senate longest, the majority and minority leader are chosen by their own party caucus. The party caucus is the group of either Democrats or Republicans, or for that matter, members of the Green Party, whatever, that work in the Senate. So they choose who they want to run the show there. So currently, the Republicans had chosen Mitch McConnell to be the majority leader. The minority leader is a thankless job, and we very rarely know who the Senate minority leader is because they don't really do a lot, because they also have to sort of play to whatever tune the majority leader is leading everybody on. You have good majority leaders and minority leaders, and you have bad ones. It really depends on the person. So this gives me an excuse to talk about my boy Lyndon again. Lyndon Johnson is, in the 1950s, sort of the guy who remakes what the majority leader is. Prior to Johnson, the majority leader had been a thankless job that people would regularly quit that they didn't want. And Johnson realized that if he were able to push legislation forward and also, as we would see, make regular use of the senatorial whip, who does the same thing as in the House. They're the ones that have to sort of corral all the votes. Johnson was able to use his force of personality and his deal-making ability. We talked about that way back at the beginning of the year with log rolling, right? Remember we talked about like the Hell River Canyon and how people out west didn't really care about passing civil rights bills in the 1950s because there were very small African-American populations out west. So he said, well, hey, if you guys can vote along with this, I can get you government funding to build hydroelectric dams in Idaho and Washington and Oregon. That is the power of the majority leader, to sort of steer people towards the creation of bills and then the passage of those bills. The other big power that people like Lyndon who don't respect your personal space have as the majority leader is this right here. This is italicized for a reason. You need to know this. The Senate majority leader, and for that matter, the minority leader, have the power to appoint people and bills to committees. So, to be clear here, the majority leader will appoint their party members to their various committees. So they're the ones that say, hey, you're on committee X, Y, and Z, you're on committee A, B, and C. The minority leader gets to do the same thing for their party. The majority leader does not pick for both parties, they only pick for theirs. But when it comes to determining which bills go to which committees, which we will see on the next slide, that is solely up to the majority leader. So the majority leader can sort of steer bills into committees that he knows they will get passed through, or if he doesn't like a bill, they can do the exact opposite and steer it towards a committee that he wants to see killed. So he's like, hey, this committee I know won't like this bill. We're going to send it to them and they will kill it in committee. So the majority leader is the one that sort of directs the workings of the Senate when it's done well. So again, currently Mitch McConnell, minority leader, Chuck Schumer. Yeah, so let's keep on rolling. Now, congressional elections. We have used these terms before, but we need to go through this again and just make sure we're all clear on it. So the incumbent is the person by whom the seat is currently held. 90% of incumbents were reelected in 2012. That number usually stays around the same. 2014, as we discussed, is kind of your only outlier where there was a big Republican push to pick up more Senate seats. Obviously, Senate is not affected by gerrymandering like running for the House is, because the Senate, you have the entire House, or I'm sorry, you have the entire state voting for you at all times. But being the incumbent is a major electoral benefit, be that in the House, in the Senate, or for the president for that matter, because you can turn around and point at everything you have done successfully, and hopefully you have done some stuff successfully. Also, you just have name recognition, is people have heard of Tester. People have heard of Daines. Now, this will be sort of an interesting election for us in the fall because people have also heard of Bullock. So that's name recognition versus name recognition. When you have sort of an up-and-comer out of nowhere, it's a little harder to do if you are in a battleground state. On the other hand, if you are in a safe Republican or safe Democratic state, it's a little easier for you to be a nobody. I mean, look at Barack Obama, for example. He's running for Senate in a safe Democratic state. He doesn't really need to worry about anything going on with whoever's running against him as a Republican. We've got pork, which is sort of going back to look at all this great stuff I've done for you. Pork are additional bits of legislation that can get added on that directly benefit your district or state. So, district, obviously, for the House, state for the Senate. Um, Pork is frowned upon, and justifiably so, is sometimes people see it as a waste of money. It's usually seen as a waste of money outside of the district or the state where it's coming in, and inside of that district or state, it's considered, hey, here's the government helping out a business. We've got tax subsidies to, create a factory here or to build a dam or a power plant or whatever. Pork is usually stapled onto larger bills, and I do mean that in a literal sense. Like, you will have a 120-page bill that's going to do a bunch of stuff, and then to get each individual senator or representative to buy into it, you have people like Lyndon Johnson going around, like the example we just talked about, where he would staple on basically, and also, Idaho gets this funding for the bridge, or Oregon gets this for the power plant, and you just tack it on. So the main intent of the bill is to provide a specific service or a specific thing that the government wants to accomplish, and then pork is there to legally bribe, you could almost say, people to voting for it. Because, hey, my state doesn't really care about this, or my state doesn't like what this bill's doing, but if you can throw something our way, if you can give us some pork, we're more likely to play ball and sign off on this bill and pass it. Prior to the 17th Amendment, state houses elected senators. You will recall we talked about this a while ago. We also talked about the fact that Montana beat the 17th Amendment to the punch after the whole dude from Anaconda literally bought himself a Senate seat by bribing every single guy in the Capitol building to vote for him. The thinking there was that the Senate should be somebody that was already serving in the Capitol and knew what the entire state needed. As communication got better, that was a less good argument, and now senators are popularly elected instead. Also, only one senator per state per election. We sort of tap danced around this a little while ago, but do remember this. You can't have both of your senators up at the same time. You want that rollover junior senior senator, so one senator can sort of show the other one the ropes. That's not to say they're always going to get along. Some senators get along fine, some don't. Most of them are probably perfectly civil with each other and don't love each other. I would assume that is probably what we see with Tester and Daines. But yeah, if a senator leaves because they've just, decided to resign for personal or family issues or whatever, that's fine. Or they could also be, like Jeff Sessions, chosen to be the head of the Department of Justice, be the Attorney General. At that point, there's kind of a two-step process that happens, and it depends on timing. Sometimes the new senator rather, will be appointed by the governor. It really depends on the state constitution. And other times, there will be a special election held right away. That's what happened in Alabama with Sessions, which led to the whole thing where a Democrat actually won that because Judge Roy Moore was running for the Republicans, and we've discussed Roy Moore and the allegations against him in the past. There is no just doubling up. It's not like you would have both senators from Oklahoma being up for election every 6 years at the same time. Like, they wouldn't both be up in 2022 and 2028. They stagger that. Okay, so I've talked a lot about committees. Let's take a look at committees. Committees are used by both houses to break out experts on specific issues. Now, this is not to say that every senator is an expert on every issue, far from it, but the longer somebody stays in either the House or the Senate, the better they get within their committee. And the more senior they are in the committee, the more power they have. So by the time you are called the committee chair, which is the person that is going to run the committee, they are the ones that will set the agenda. They are the ones that will dole out various roles within the committee. By the time you're the committee chair, you are the most senior member of the majority party in that committee. That is a big, big, big deal. So the role of a committee is to do the following things. And you do need to know all of this stuff over here. I'm not going to ask you to name every single committee. That would be insane. But the role of a committee is to study issues. So let's choose the Defense Committee. The Defense Committee, in both the House and the Senate, they're two different committees. And what they're going to do is they will study issues. So what is the best contract that we could get to build a new fighter plane? What is the best sort of deal we can get on a contract for making MREs? Whatever. We've had issues with mental health in our troops over the last decades. What can we best do for that? So some of them will study issues that sometimes they will investigate, which is a different thing. Study is sort of like, okay, give us a rundown on what's happening. Investigation for issues is what you will normally see happen in these subcommittees, which we'll talk about in a sec, where they're going to investigate something that has gone awry. So, for example, Harry Truman in the 1940s investigated what was essentially war profiteering for the Armed Services Committee. He said that money is being misspent here, and as a result, people are basically wasting U.S. tax dollars, and companies are stealing from the government in the middle of World War II. That's not okay. So he led an investigation into that. It's the same thing you saw with the Benghazi Committee in the House. What they will also do, and this is a big, 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 guys, it's big, part of it, is they're the ones that examine bills. So once that bill gets assigned to the, again, let's say Armed Services Committee of the Senate by the Senate Majority Leader, or the House Majority Leader would assign it over here. What'll happen is they will look over that bill in detail. This is their area of expertise. Most senators are on 2 or 3 committees. Members of the House are on a few more. And you'll usually have like your primary committee, and then there will be a couple that you might sit on, but you don't do a ton of the heavy lifting there. In your primary committee, you should be an expert in it. And some of that will be staff members that help you out as well. And what you'll do there is you will look over that bill with a fine-tooth comb and say, this works, this doesn't, this needs to be changed, this needs to be added, yada, yada, yada. But they're going to look into those bills, and then eventually they will make recommendations on that. So the standing committees are these ones that are permanent. They don't go anywhere. Some of them have more impact than others. So, for example, Senate Armed Services is a big, big, big one. Over here, the Ways and Means Committee is basically the Taxes Committee. That is sort of the brass ring. That is the thing you want in the House. That's a big one. Senate Judiciary Committee is a big deal because they're the ones that are going to interview every single and hold hearings for every single judge that gets appointed by the president before the Senate decides to vote on them. So that is a big deal because they will make a recommendation that says, yes, rest of the Senate, you should vote for this judge, or no, rest of the Senate, you should not vote for this judge. They're not qualified. So that's a big deal for that committee. So under each standing committee, obviously, energy and commerce, for example, is a big concept. So they're going to break into subcommittees. And there they will get into specific areas of proposed legislation. So like our energy and commerce subcommittee might have one that deals with nuclear power, one that deals with renewable energy, one that deals with coal and fossil fuels, one that deals with certain aspects of, Wall Street, whatever. But the idea is that those subcommittees can spend more time dealing with something in even more minute detail, and then they come back and can report on the efficacy of, whatever they've discovered. Say, yes, this should get added to the bill, that should get taken out. The end goal of all of this is to refer bills to the floor of either the House or the Senate for debate, which would basically be the House or Senate committee saying, yes, this bill as it stands right now should be debated because we think it's good enough to go up and be talked about and maybe become a law. They can also, though, kill them. What that means, they're not like dragging the senator who wrote it into a back room and shooting him or anything like that. Killing a bill means that it's not going to get out of committee. They're basically going to say this bill is trash. Don't worry about it. And sometimes they won't even let it out of committee. Sometimes they won't even take a vote on it in committee because it's that much of a waste of everyone's time. Easier to do from the majority side than the minority side, which is not particularly surprising because, as we've established, the minority gets to play the tune that the majority plays the tune that the rest of the Senate is going to follow. So they need the minority, that is, needs to sort of play along with whatever the majority dictates. We're almost there, folks. There are a couple other types of committees. So the standing committees are the big ones. Those are the ones that are going to do our heavy lifting. These are more investigative committees, at least in the first case here. So a special or select committee is going to be temporary. It will be created to do a specific thing and make a suggestion on what should be done with that. So they're going to look into one particular issue. So, for example, we've got Harry Truman here in the war profiteering one I talked about a couple minutes ago. Over here, we've got Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin looking into alleged communist infiltration of the American government, which turned out was not really a thing. And these committees can get out of hand, let's put it that way. Joe McCarthy threatened to call both George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower, two of American history's greatest civil servants who wanted nothing but the best for America. He threatened to call them communists because they didn't like him. Joe McCarthy was a bad senator and a drunk, and eventually his committee was showing something on television, and he was essentially embarrassed into oblivion by a defense lawyer for the Army. So good for that guy. You can look more of that up later. More recently, though, there was a special committee to investigate 9/11 that issued the 9/11 report, basically that showed us all the errors that were made in the intelligence community leading up to 9/11 that allowed it to happen, and then made a series of suggestions, which we have since adopted, that have changed that. So sometimes you have a witch hunt done for publicity. Sometimes you have something that is done for the betterment of the country. Sometimes you have an investigation that is done to make suggestions that will make the country better in the long run. And then sometimes you have Benghazi, which is really much more of a politically motivated sort of thing than anything that, leads anywhere. The Benghazi committee literally never came up with any report and was used mainly for political purposes. Next up, joint committees. These are shared by both houses. So members of the Senate and the House are going to sit on a joint committee. And that's why it's called a joint committee. There's economic planning ones. There's one for the Library of Congress. There's one for printing, which is literally just like printing out the congressional record every week and like making, that available to people. And also taxation. So while House Ways and Means is going to be the one that has to originate the taxation bills, the taxation committee is there to make sure that before those bills go very far, the Senate has a say in it, so it is actually a passable bill. So that's sort of a weird workaround there, but it leads us perfectly into our next type of committee, which is a conference committee. Whereas that joint committee on taxation, they just sort of make suggestions. They're not writing bills on their own. The conference committee is there once both houses have written a bill and it's time to actually start voting on them. So they are there to do what is called reconcile a bill. And I want you to write this down even if there's not a line for it in your notes. Reconciling a bill. What's going to happen there is you will have a Senate bill that has, 512 pages and a House bill that has 512 pages, but there are 6 differences between them. Sometimes it is a comma, sometimes it is a paragraph, sometimes it is a choice of words. But if those bills are not identical when they're voted for, then it doesn't count as voting on the same bill. It's essentially voting on 2 different bills that the other house would then have to approve. So the conference committee is there to fix this. So say the House has passed a bill and they want to send it to the Senate. The Senate might convene a conference committee with the people that wrote the bill in the House and say, okay, we like that you've passed this, but we have issues with, A, B, and C here. Can you fix those and vote on it again? And then they will negotiate. So the conference committee is there to essentially negotiate what needs to be done to ensure that both houses pass the exact same bill. Sounds kind of boring. Um, it's very much like a negotiation committee. That's what it's there to do. But conference committees are integral. Bill reconciliation is what makes laws get passed in America, full stop. Sometimes it's done in a very sort of leisurely, gentlemanly manner where they will go back and forth. They will have that shared Google Docs. They will edit it together, and it's beautiful. Sometimes it is absolute chaos where reconciliation is literally this happened like 2 years ago with the big tax bill that was passed by Paul Ryan's House. Is there were literally reconciliations being written into the margins with like a Sharpie, and just like, we're also adding this in, and as long as both sides agree to it, that's fine. It'll get officially typed up by the House later, um, and when it's passed, and then, we send it out for that joint committee to print. But yeah, so conference committees are a big, big, big deal. We are going to pick up on jobs within the jobs next week. I think that's the best way to do this. You've hung in here a long time. So this week we have gone over the roles and powers of the Senate, and also the roles and the substantial powers of the various committees. Assuming we get to do some form of mock Congress, and Mrs. Williams and I and Mr. Kelly are really working on this, we're going to try to do something. I would like you guys take 5 minutes. It's not an official assignment. Look these over, and which of these seem most interesting to you? So that's kind of it. We're done with that. There will be another 3 to 5 question quiz that goes along with it this week. So hopefully you knock that out of the park. Be sure to use your notes on that. And as always, if you have questions, hit me up on Thursday or via email or remind, and I will do my best to answer them. Have a good one, folks. Hope you enjoyed talking about Senates and congressional committees. Woo!